I once lay on an operating table for 11 hours to donate a kidney to save my daughter. Once signed a check to buy her a house worth more than $1 million so she could step into her boyfriend's world and the relationships deemed on the right level. But at the year-end party of the company where her boyfriend works, under cold lights, amid business cards passing hands and teared glances, it was the very child I saved who tilted her head and said I was too slow, too out of place, not stylish enough to stand beside her, then dropped a sentence that froze the entire room. I wish the kidney donor weren't Dad, so I wouldn't have to hear him talk about what he did. In that moment, I understood that some humiliations do not need noise. They only need to be spoken in the right place, at the right time, in front of the very people you are trying to impress. If you have ever given everything and then been treated like an extra detail, leave it and tell me where you are listening to this story from. And if you want to keep listening to stories where the truth does not shout yet still stands upright, I would appreciate a follow from you. The phone vibrated at exactly 9 p.m., just as my small apartment had finally settled after a long day. Outside on the balcony, the San Diego sea breeze blew lightly, carrying the familiar salty smell. I was sitting on a low wooden chair, a cup of tea at my right hand, the weekly pill organizer still open on the table. The screen lit up with Lauren's name. I looked for one more beat before picking up, not because of hesitation, but because I had grown used to letting my daughter wait a little longer, the same way she often let me wait. Dad! Lauren's voice came through clearly, but not from a quiet space. Behind it were layered sounds, thin jazz drifting, laughter bursting out then being reined in, the dry, bright clink of glasses like metal. I pictured the scene quickly, a year-end networking event, warm lights, carefully chosen outfits, handshakes tight enough not to seem crude, loose enough to leave a way out. "What are you doing, Dad?" Lauren asked, more out of social habit than curiosity. "I just got back," I said. "Just made some tea." There was a very brief pause, just long enough for me to know she was weighing her words. Lauren had never been good at hiding her calculations. She had only grown more skilled at draping her choices in a soft layer of politeness. "Dad," Lauren began, lowering her voice by a notch, as if saying something that needed to be understood correctly. "I'm calling to talk ahead of time about Christmas." I didn't answer right away. I clearly heard someone near Lauren laugh loudly, the easy laughter of a person with nothing to worry about tomorrow, then someone calling her name, drawn out and familiar. Lauren moved the phone away for a moment, said something quickly, then came back. "Evan's family is hosting a Christmas party at their place," Lauren continued. "Very selective. The kind of party where everyone in the industry shows up. I think it's going to be very important for the upcoming work." "Yeah," I said. Just one word. I was used to hearing Lauren lay out the context before getting to the point. "You know," Lauren went on, "events like this aren't like family dinners. This party is pretty selective, and I'm afraid you wouldn't be comfortable there." I looked down at my hands. The fingers still bore faint calluses at the joints, the kind that, even though I'd left construction years ago, refused to disappear completely. I gently turned the old ring on my ring finger, a habit formed from days of standing for hours under the sun, waiting for concrete to set just right. "And?" I asked, my voice unchanged. Lauren took a very soft breath. When she spoke, the words had already been trimmed. No extra, no missing pieces, no room for misunderstanding. "Dad," Lauren said slowly and clearly, "this is a very selective party, and I think you don't fit the Christmas vibe this year." The sentence fell lightly, without a loud sound, but I felt exactly where it landed. Not in my ears, but in an old hollow inside my chest, a place I had once believed I'd reinforced thick enough. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask what is vibe. I had lived long enough to know those questions only prolonged something already clear. I stayed silent. Lauren, on the other end of the line, fell silent too, as if waiting for me to respond according to a familiar script, a chuckle, a word of understanding, a voluntary retreat so she could feel unburdened. In that silence, I heard very clearly what Lauren probably didn't think I would notice. Champagne being poured, ice touching glass, a man saying something that made the surrounding group laugh. I pictured Lauren standing slightly angled, a well-fitted dress, a smile placed just right, eyes always aimed toward whatever benefited her future most. I understand, I said at last, not because I truly understood in the way Lauren hoped, but because I understood enough not to ask more. Lauren exhaled, relieved. I knew you'd understand. We can meet after Christmas, okay? When things settle down? Yeah, I replied. This time the word was rounded and closed, revealing nothing behind it. I have to get back, Lauren said quickly. Everyone's waiting. You take care of your things, I said. I'm fine. The call ended with a clean click. The phone screen went dark, briefly reflecting my face. I set the phone down on the table, right next to the pill organizer. The apartment returned to its familiar nighttime sounds, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the wind slipping through a crack in the door, the distant waves I could only hear when everything else had gone quiet. I sat still for a long time. There was no burst of anger, no complaint, just a slow internal rearranging, like when I stood before an old structure and realized some cracks no longer belonged to repair. Lauren was right about one thing. It was a selective party. And somehow I was no longer on the list of those selected by my own daughter. Not because I did anything wrong tonight, but because I existed in a way that didn't fit the picture she was building. I stood up, put the empty cup into the sink, washed my hands more carefully than usual. Warm water ran over the pronounced veins, reminding me of my current rhythm of life. Slower, more cautious, but still mine. On the table, the pill organizer was closed neatly. I turned off the living room light, leaving only the dim glow from the kitchen, enough so the apartment wouldn't sink completely into darkness. Before going into the bedroom, I looked back at the phone one more time. No new messages, no added explanations, and I understood there wouldn't be any. Some sentences don't need explaining. They place themselves firmly in memory. After the call ended, I didn't stand up right away. I remained seated on the wooden chair for a long time, long enough for the tea in front of me to go completely cold, the thin layer of steam fading without leaving a trace. In the small apartment, everything stayed exactly where it always was. Only I felt as if I had just been shifted slightly to the side, like an object that no longer fit the room it had occupied for so many years. I raised a hand to my chest and took a deep breath. My breathing was no longer as seamless as it used to be. It came slower, shorter, forcing me to pay attention to every expansion and collapse of my lungs. My body had begun changing like this years ago, not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly and persistently, the way a structure deteriorates when tiny, easily ignored cracks are left unattended. There were afternoons when I had to lie down simply because the short walk from the parking lot to the office made my head spin slightly. There were mornings when I woke up with exhaustion clinging to me as if the night before had never existed. The doctor called it the post-donation adjustment phase, said my body was learning how to function with less. I called it learning to accept slowing down, a lesson with no syllabus, only lived experience. It was during those forced slow days that memories began returning more vividly, as if someone were gradually opening doors I had tried hard to keep shut. I remembered the afternoon Lauren collapsed in her college dorm. The phone call from her roommate came out of nowhere, her voice trembling with fear. I still remember that moment clearly, just the word hospital, but it was enough to send a chill straight down my spine. When I arrived, Lauren was lying on the emergency bed, her skin pale, lips dry, her eyes that had once been so bright now sunken, as if she hadn't slept for days. She still tried to smile when she saw me, a weak smile, painfully familiar. "Don't worry, Dad," Lauren said, her voice small and hoarse. "I probably just studied too much." I nodded, even though I didn't believe it. I held her hand, a hand that had once been strong, now cold and so light it made me afraid that squeezing even a little might hurt her. I sat by her bed all night, never leaving. I counted every machine rhythm, every time a nurse walked in, every moment Lauren opened her eyes and closed them again, as if the instant I looked away, she might slip out of reach. The next morning, the doctor called me into the hallway. White lights shone straight down onto the floor, casting no shadows. She spoke in a calm, professional tone, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "Lauren isn't just exhausted," she said. "The tests show her kidney function has declined severely." I stood frozen. In my mind, there was only one simple, almost naive thought. She was too young. Lauren was barely in her 20s, with an entire life ahead of her. I asked, my voice rough, whether there had been a mistake. The doctor shook her head and explained genetic factors, cases that showed no clear symptoms until the body could no longer cope. She said the illness had been progressing quietly for a long time. It was only now revealing itself. The days that followed passed in the smell of disinfectant and white lights that never turned off. Lauren grew weaker. She was so tired that even talking required pauses to catch her breath. Once, when I helped her sit up, she leaned her head against my shoulder, light as a child. I heard her whisper very softly, as if afraid of hurting me, "Dad, if I get better, I'll take care of you. I promise. I'll do everything you've done for me." I didn't answer right away. I just gently stroked her hair, the same hair that used to be tangled by sea wind when she was little. I didn't say I didn't need to be taken care of. I also didn't say that some promises are born not to be fulfilled, but to give the person speaking them a little more endurance at their weakest moment. Lauren called me the greatest person in the world during those days. She said it to doctors, to nurses, to anyone who entered the room. I heard it and smiled, but I didn't keep those words for myself. In my mind, there was only one thought, clear enough that it didn't need saying. If she lived, everything else could be set aside. And from the moment the doctor spoke about the remaining options, about the possibility of a living kidney donor, I understood that this white room was where I would have to make a decision, not out of impulsive emotion, but with the certainty of a father who saw no other path. The inpatient room on the 6th floor of UC San Diego Medical Center had a smell all its own, a blend of disinfectant, medical plastic, and air that had been filtered so thoroughly it seemed stripped of all emotion. Fluorescent lights spread evenly across walls, floors, and skin, making every color look paler than it really was, as if this place were not designed for living, only for waiting. Lauren lay in the hospital bed by the window, an IV line in her arm, eyes closed but not deeply asleep. The monitor's rhythm sounded steady and repetitive, so constant one could forget. It existed until it stopped, and it was precisely that steadiness that kept me from leaving. I sat on the low chair beside the bed, my back still straight from years of habit, though my shoulders had begun to ache. On the small table next to me was a thick file with a clear plastic cover. Inside, tightly clipped pages, filled with dense black print. I had read through them many times, not because I understood everything, but because I didn't want the feeling that I had missed something simply by reading too fast. A brief knock sounded, just enough as a warning. Dr. Helena Mitchell stepped in. She wasn't rushed, nor did she try to appear gentle. She pulled up a chair, sat facing me, set the file on her lap, her hands folded together, the posture of someone long accustomed to saying what no one wanted to hear. "Mr. Hale," she began, her voice even and clear, "Lauren's condition is progressive kidney failure due to genetic factors. Her glomerular filtration levels have dropped to the point where replacement therapy can no longer be delayed." I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I knew I needed to keep listening. "Without a transplant," she said, "Lauren will require regular dialysis. This directly affects quality of life and significantly reduces long-term prospects. The current wait list for a deceased donor kidney averages 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years? I didn't calculate. I just looked at Lauren. She kept her eyes closed, her lashes trembling faintly, as if trying to keep herself at the surface of sleep. I knew she could hear. Lauren always heard, even when she pretended not to. In cases with a compatible living donor, the doctor continued, outcomes are usually better. Waiting time is nearly zero, and the recipient's ability to adapt is higher. The risks for the donor? I asked. Dr. Mitchell didn't evade the question. There are risks. After donation, the donor requires long-term monitoring. The remaining kidney must work harder. Some people experience prolonged fatigue, need to adjust their lifestyle, limit heavy labor, and comply with regular checkups. Not everyone has serious complications, but this is a lifelong change. I didn't ask for percentages. I didn't need numbers to understand the essence. I had lived long enough to know that every major decision carries a cost. The only difference is whether you pay with money, with time, or with your own body. Has the family discussed this? The doctor asked. I answered for both of us without looking at Lauren. I'm willing to be tested. Lauren opened her eyes. Her gaze held neither panic nor joy, just a sudden clarity as someone pulled from an incomplete sleep. Dad, Lauren said, her voice hoarse from a dry throat. You don't have to. I placed my hand on the bed rail, not touching her, just close enough for her to know I was there. Let the doctors do their work, I said quietly. You rest. Lauren looked at me for another moment, then turned her face toward the window. Afternoon light filtered through the curtains, painting pale patches on the wall without clear shapes, exactly like the future at that moment, present but not yet nameable. The tests moved faster than I expected. Blood, urine, scans, and questionnaires long enough to tire you just by reading them. I signed every form placed in front of me, the familiar handwriting of someone who had signed hundreds of blueprints, contracts, and inspection reports. This time, my hand didn't shake, but I felt the weight of every page. 1 week later, the doctor called me into a private room. The compatibility is very good, she said. We recommend proceeding with the transplant as soon as possible. There was no applause, no moment of celebration, just a decision confirmed in cold medical language, like stamping approval on a sentence both sides had voluntarily signed. On the day of surgery, the corridor leading to the operating room was long and so brightly lit it made you lose your sense of direction. I changed into a patient gown, put on the thin robe, lay on the gurney, and watched the ceiling slide past in segments as the nurse pushed me forward. Lauren was taken into another room. We didn't say goodbye the way people usually describe it, only a very slight nod as the two gurneys passed each other at an intersection. The surgery lasted many hours. When I woke up, my throat burned with dryness. My body felt heavy, pressed into the bed. Everything blurred and then sharpened again. I heard someone call my name, heard the machines, felt the dull but steady pain, like a rhythm reminding me that I was still here, even if no longer whole the way I had been before. After the surgery, Lauren recovered faster than the doctors had predicted. Her skin regained its color within just a few weeks. Her eyes became lively again, her voice stronger, and at follow-up appointments, she sat up straight, answered clearly, smiled at the right moments, as if her body had simply been returned to its natural rhythm. When she was discharged, Lauren walked out to the parking lot with the familiar gait of a young person, light and quick, without looking back at the glass doors behind her. I was different. My recovery had no clear shape to name. It wasn't sharp pain or complications, just a quiet sense of depletion, like pressure being slowly released from a system that had long operated at a high level. I didn't collapse, but I also no longer stood the way I used to. In the first months after discharge, I tried to maintain my old routine. I still went to work early, still wore my old safety boots, the pair that had followed me across countless job sites, the leather worn but the structure still firm. I still tried to stand for long periods during site inspections, tried to complete a full round before sitting down, but my body began responding in its own way. The fatigue didn't come immediately. It waited until I got home, closed the door, and only then rose, heavy and dense. In the small kitchen, a clear plastic box appeared on the table. Inside it, small compartments holding different pills, arranged by day of the week. At first, I had to look carefully to remember the order. Later, my hand automatically opened the correct compartment at the correct time, a reflex learned through repetition. Midday became a necessary marker, not because I wanted to rest, but because if I didn't lie down for a while, my mind would slow in a way that made everything afterward heavier. I set a short alarm, just enough to doze, not enough to fall into deep sleep. When I woke, the room was still quiet, the light unchanged. I stood up and continued the remaining work, without complaint, without telling anyone. Lauren, meanwhile, began to accelerate. She returned to school and completed her final courses, with a focus I had rarely seen before. On graduation day, she stood in the courtyard, her mortarboard slightly askew, her smile wide and confident, speaking about the future with a steady voice, no longer hesitant. A job at a large agency in Los Angeles came faster than expected, and when Lauren called to tell me, her voice was higher than usual, carrying a new tone, like confirmation that she had stepped into a different world. The conversations that followed began to change, at first subtly. Lauren talked about coworkers, long brainstorm sessions, deadlines, and clients. I listened, asked a few questions, felt happy for her, but gradually the words she used no longer sounded the same. She spoke more about brands, about image, about needing to appear in the right places at the right times. She used network as a verb rather than a noun, spoke of relationships as lines of connection that had to be constantly maintained. I didn't see anything wrong with it, I only saw that it was different. Some evenings, Lauren stopped by my apartment, standing briefly at the doorway, her eyes quickly scanning the familiar space. The old wooden table, the low bookshelf, the safety boots neatly placed in the corner. She asked about my health, asked in the right way, in a properly performed role. I answered briefly, without detail. She spoke more. I listened more. We sat across from each other, but the distance was no longer measured in meters. When Lauren left, I tidied the kitchen, washed 2 cups, placed them on the rack. Everything remained intact. Only the rhythm of my life and the rhythm of hers no longer aligned. At work, I was moved to a lighter position. No one said outright that I was no longer strong enough, but the way schedules were arranged set it for them. I didn't object. I understood my body well enough to know where the limits were. I worked more slowly, more carefully. Small details began to matter more than speed. In the afternoon, when taking off my shoes, I often paused for a moment before placing them back in their old spot. The safety boots were more worn now, but I kept them, not out of nostalgia, but because they reminded me of how firmly I had once stood. Lauren moved forward without needing to look back. She changed her style of dress, talked about after-work meetups, and about parties with important people. She didn't brag, only recounted them as a natural part of the job. I listened, nodded, didn't ask deeply. 2 paths took shape clearly without colliding, one slowing down to maintain balance, the other accelerating to seize opportunity. We were still father and daughter, still talked, still met, but each time we stood side by side, I began to realize we were using 2 different languages to name the same world. And I understood, even without saying it, that this difference was not yet conflict. It was only the first step of a distance quietly opening, steadily, like 2 lines starting from the same point and silently drifting farther and farther apart. The call came late in the evening, just after I had turned off the living room lights. Lauren spoke very softly, as if afraid of breaking something being held together by silence, telling me that this weekend she would be meeting Evan's family, then pausing for a beat before adding that everything would probably be a bit formal. I didn't ask more. I was used to those pauses in her voice, which usually signaled something difficult coming. The introduction took place at a large house north of the city, where everything was arranged to project abundance without ostentation. The garden was neatly trimmed, warm yellow light spilling from tall glass windows. I wore a light-colored shirt and clean shoes, stood beside Lauren as the doorbell rang, and she adjusted my sleeve, the movement quick and slightly stiff. Dinner unfolded politely. Evan's family talked about work, travel, and long-term projects. I listened more than I spoke. When they asked what I did, I answered briefly about maintenance and technical supervision. No one was rude, but I noticed Lauren growing quieter. The smile on her face held a little too long. On the drive back, Lauren said nothing. When the car stopped in front of my apartment, she stayed seated for a few seconds, then started crying. Not loudly, not sobbing, just tears falling continuously, as if they had been waiting. "I'm sorry," Lauren said, her voice breaking. "I know I shouldn't think this way, but I feel ashamed." I didn't respond right away. I looked at her and saw the exhaustion of someone trying to stand upright in a space that didn't yet belong to her. Lauren said my apartment was too small, that Evan's family lived in a different world, that she was afraid of being judged and afraid of being seen as someone from a background not polished enough. I listened to everything without interrupting, and when she finished, I only told her to go inside, drink some water, and get some rest. I promised nothing and argued nothing, because some emotions, if challenged immediately, only sink deeper. 2 days later, I called my old lawyer, the one who had handled contracts for me for years. We met in his small office, everything arranged neatly in the habit of someone who works with paperwork. I told him I was considering buying a house for my daughter, but wanted to understand the risks clearly. He listened, asked detailed questions, then explained slowly, talking about ownership, about whose name was on the title, about the difference between a family occupancy arrangement and a legal tenancy. He used the term licensee, explaining that when adult children live in a parent's home without paying rent and without a lease, they are not tenants under the law, which allows the owner to retain clear control and avoid disputes later. I hadn't gone there to guard against my own child. I went to understand the structure of a major decision. I had built houses from bare ground and knew the most important thing was not the surface, but the foundation. The purchase moved quickly, but not recklessly. I found a suitable house in the area Lauren wanted, large enough to host guests, refined enough that she wouldn't have to explain herself. The price was finalized at $1,500,000. Escrow opened properly, the deposit transferred on schedule, the title recorded in my name, the mortgage, homeowner's insurance, property taxes, all signed and borne by me. On key day, Lauren stood in the sun-filled living room, slowly turning in a circle, touching the kitchen counter, opening windows, stepping out to the back patio. Her smile returned, this time genuine. She hugged me, thanked me repeatedly, said she would take good care of the house, and that this would be where she built her future. I only nodded. I didn't mention the paperwork, and I didn't promise to transfer ownership later. I simply said she should live there, settle in, and focus on her work. In the months that followed, the house quickly became the center of Lauren's life. She hosted small dinners, invited coworkers, and Evan's friends. I didn't visit often, and when I did, I brought a few repair tools, checked technical details out of old habit. Lauren introduced me as family, but the way she spoke had changed, shorter, more neutral. I continued paying the mortgage regularly, renewing insurance on time, and paying property taxes ahead of schedule. I didn't tell Lauren the numbers, not to hide them, but because I considered it my responsibility, like a foundation underground that doesn't need daily mention. Once, the lawyer called again, reminding me to maintain clear boundaries, not to accept rent, and not to sign any occupancy agreement that could be misinterpreted. I listened and remembered. I didn't find it cold. I found it necessary. Lauren grew accustomed to the new space, talked more about hosting, about how the house helped her fit better into her environment. I listened without comment, only realizing that as she stepped into a new circle, I was standing still at the edge, looking in. One evening, after finishing a small repair in the garage, I paused on the front steps and looked at the entire facade. The house was solid, well built, up to standard. I knew how each part would bear load, how water would drain, how it would function 10 or 20 years from now. I kept my name on the title, not to hold power, but out of a builder's habit. Do it right first, then rest easy letting someone else live inside. Nothing disappeared overnight. It faded little by little, slowly enough that a person could convince themselves they were imagining it. I realized it for the first time when I noticed my name no longer appearing in Lauren's stories. Not because I was spoken badly of, but because I wasn't mentioned at all. Lauren began posting more on social media, carefully curated photos with warm lighting, a wine glass placed just right, the spacious kitchen behind her always immaculate. She wrote short lines about her career journey, about long workdays, about personal effort. People left familiar praise. Independent, impressive, self-made. I read without reacting, not because I was upset, but because I didn't know where I was supposed to stand in those words. Parties followed one another. Project celebrations, co-workers' birthdays, weekend gatherings without reason. The house lights were on more often. Every time I stopped by, it was an inconvenient moment. Lauren was getting ready to go out, or there were guests, or she had just come home exhausted and needed rest. I learned to call ahead, then learned not to call at all. Once I was in the garage fixing a small issue with the lighting system. Laughter drifted out from the living room. I heard Lauren introducing the house, talking about the layout, and about her personal aesthetic. There was no place for me in that story. I tightened the screw, wiped my hands, and quietly left before anyone noticed I had been there. Money was not so quiet. Every month it moved on schedule. The mortgage was deducted on the exact day, homeowner's insurance was renewed ahead of time, and property taxes were paid in full. I kept an expense tracker on my computer, not to calculate, but to avoid confusion. The numbers appeared clearly, without emotion or interpretation. Mortgage, insurance, maintenance, utilities. Lauren didn't pay, I didn't ask. I knew exactly what I was paying for, not just a house, but the setting for parties, the backdrop for photos, the address used to impress. Everything ran so smoothly that I almost vanished from the picture. Lauren's way of speaking changed. She used more new words, spoke faster and cleaner. When she talked about work, she emphasized personal effort, figuring it out on her own, the need to prove herself. I listened and nodded. I didn't correct her, and I didn't recount what I had done. I thought some things didn't need to be spoken to exist, but that existence grew fainter. On the rare occasions I was invited to stay for dinner, conversations were always cut short. Lauren's phone kept vibrating. She stood to take calls, returned to apologize, and said something urgent had come up. I helped clear the dishes, washed them, and then left. No conflict, only drift. I began coming by at different hours. Early morning before the sun was harsh, midday when Lauren was at work, to check what needed checking and fix what needed fixing. The house functioned well. I treated that as responsibility, not presence. One afternoon, I sat in my car outside the gate, watching strangers walk in, laughing easily, and realized I had become an outsider in the very space I created. No one pushed me away. No one said an unkind word. I simply wasn't part of the day's plan. The expense spreadsheet grew longer, numbers accumulating by month, by quarter. I didn't share it with Lauren, and I didn't bring it up with the lawyer. I left everything where it belonged, the way I always had. What made it clearest wasn't the money or the lengthening silences, but the way Lauren told her story. Neat, polished, convincing enough for listeners to believe everything was built from personal effort. In that story, there was no place for me, No one mentioned me, and no one noticed the absence. I sat in my small apartment, opened the expense sheet one more time, then closed the computer, not angry, not resentful, just facing something obvious, clear enough to need no explanation. I was paying for a life I stood at the edge of, a life running smoothly, without me in it. Not long before the Christmas call, there had already been another dinner I wasn't invited to. The call came one late November afternoon while I was changing a light bulb in the kitchen. Lauren spoke quickly, her tone light, as if she had rehearsed it. She said that this year, Thanksgiving would be held at one of Evan's friends' houses, the space quite crowded, the schedule packed, lots of unfamiliar people. Then she paused for a very brief beat, just long enough for me to recognize what was coming. "You've been tired a lot lately, Dad," she said. "I'm afraid you wouldn't keep up, and if you had to leave early, it would be awkward." I tightened the bulb, more than necessary, then let go. There were no questions, no explanations. I just told her to focus on her own plans and not worry about me. Lauren thanked me, her voice relieved. The call ended neatly, politely, leaving no mark deep enough to name. I stood still for a while, looking at the newly lit bulb, its light even and steady. In my head, the phrase, "You've been tired," repeated a few times, not like an accusation, but like a pre-printed label applied to me in the right place, at the right moment. Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected. The city shifted rhythm, stores put up sale signs, parking lots grew more crowded. I stopped by the nearby grocery store and bought a small turkey, just enough for one person, along with potatoes, a few stalks of celery, and an ordinary bottle of wine. There was no one to ask about preferences, and there didn't need to be. In the afternoon, I cooked slowly, every movement familiar, no recipe required. I set the table neatly, placing one plate, one set of cutlery. The space was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking each second. I turned the television on for background noise, then turned it off. I didn't want voices intruding on my thoughts. When I sat down, I cut the first piece of turkey and ate slowly. The food wasn't bad, actually quite decent. I took a sip of wine and looked out the window. Outside, a few apartments were lit, silhouettes moving, laughter drifting faintly. I didn't feel abandoned. I only felt that I wasn't part of the day's plan. The phone vibrated once, a message from Lauren. "Enjoy dinner, Dad. Stay warm." I read it and placed the phone face down on the table. I didn't reply right away, not out of anger, but because I didn't know what more was needed beyond the truth already clearly present. I washed the dishes immediately after the meal, dried them, put them back in their places. Everything proceeded smoothly without friction. I sat down, opened a small notebook, and wrote a few brief lines. The date, a note about this month's expenses, a reminder for a follow-up appointment. No emotion attached, just the habit of someone who likes everything to stay where it belongs. I didn't think Lauren meant to hurt me. She was simply choosing the most convenient option for herself, wrapped in reasons that sounded perfectly reasonable. "You've been tired" was soft enough that no one had to apologize, concise enough that it needed no further explanation. I understood, and precisely because I understood, I didn't react. Night fell. I turned off most of the lights, leaving one small lamp in the living room. Across the table, the opposite chair sat empty. I didn't look at it for long. I didn't ask myself what would have happened if I had gone. I simply noted that I hadn't been invited, in a way that didn't require saying it outright. Some exclusions don't need harsh words. They're carried out with a tone of concern and reasons reasonable enough that no one has to say sorry. I sat there in my apartment and realized calmly that what happened today wasn't an accident. It was the natural result of changes that had been unfolding for a long time. I stood up, checked the door, turned off the lights. Before going to bed, I placed my phone on the table, screen facing down. I wasn't waiting for the next message, not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I had heard enough to understand my place. I didn't feel resentment, Resentment only makes people say things that no longer matter. I chose to remember instead. Remember how things were arranged, how words were selected, how an important day could pass without my presence. And in that quiet, I began preparing for what came next, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone who has realized that polite reasons are sometimes the prelude to decisions that are no longer polite at all. A few days before Christmas, there was a conversation I knew I would never forget. The house was quiet. Only half the kitchen lights were on, the glow falling straight onto the stone countertop, clear enough to reveal every lingering watermark. I leaned against the counter, both hands resting on the edge to steady myself. Lauren came in behind me, hung up her coat, removed her watch. Every movement was neat and precise, like someone accustomed to controlling a space. No one spoke. The hum of the air conditioner was steady, cold enough to make the kitchen feel as if it were contracting. Lauren poured water and slid the glass toward me. She avoided my eyes, looked out the window, then turned back to the sink. I took a sip. My throat eased, but my chest did not. "I want to talk," I said quietly, without emphasis. Lauren nodded. "I know." I didn't circle around it. "Do you ever think about my kidney?" Lauren froze, just for a very brief beat, but enough for me to see the question wasn't in her script. She inhaled, then exhaled. "Dad," Lauren said, "that's in the past." "What does in the past mean?" I asked. "That because it's done, it doesn't need to be remembered?" Lauren set the glass down, her fingers closing around the rim. "I didn't ask you to do that." The sentence landed on the counter. Not raised, not sharp. It was delivered like an obvious fact, kept ready for when it was needed. I looked at Lauren, waiting for a follow-up. There was none. "I know," I said. "I did it because I chose to. But have you ever asked yourself what the cost was?" Lauren leaned back against the cabinets, arms crossed. "You're fine." I shook my head very slightly. "I'm not the same. Don't you see that? I get tired faster. I move slower. Some afternoons, climbing a few steps means I have to stop." Lauren turned away, opened a drawer, took out a towel, put it back. "I thought you were used to it." "Being used to it doesn't mean it isn't there," I said. "It just means you endure it better." The air in the kitchen thickened. Lauren frowned. "What do you want me to do?" "Every time someone asks about me, should I tell them the kidney story?" "I don't need you to tell it," I said. "I need you to remember." "Remember for what?" Lauren shot back. "So I'm constantly aware I owe you?" I met her gaze. "So you know what you're standing on?" Lauren gave a short, humorless laugh. "I got here on my own legs." "I don't deny that," I said. "But in the story you tell, where do I stand?" Lauren opened her mouth and stopped. She looked around the kitchen as if searching for something to anchor her answer. Finally, she said, slower, colder, "I don't think everything needs to be tied to you." The sentence wasn't loud, but it cut cleanly. I looked down at my hands, the old calluses still there. I remembered afternoons when I had to sit on the steps before unlocking the door, the breathlessness when carrying groceries, the pills lined up neatly in their box. I didn't list any of it. I just looked up. "I don't need to be tied," I said. "I just need to be placed where I belong." Lauren fell silent. This time the silence didn't pass. It stayed, heavy and defined. She swallowed, then said very softly, "I'm afraid if I keep thinking about it, I won't be able to move forward." I understood, and because I understood, I felt cold. "I'm not holding you back," I said. "I just don't want you walking forward as if there's nothing behind you." Lauren didn't answer. She gave a very small nod, acknowledging the question's existence, not its answer. I stepped back. The floor was cool under my feet. When I turned away, Lauren called, "Dad." I stopped, but didn't turn around. She didn't continue. Some words, if spoken now, would slam a door shut. I turned off the kitchen light. In the darkness, I understood clearly. This wasn't an argument. It was a marker. Some sentences, even when spoken calmly, are enough to make it impossible to return to where you were before. A few days later, As Christmas approached, everything was no longer memory. I returned to my apartment, and Christmas Eve arrived quietly. No invitation, no schedule. Just a brief call, enough for me to understand that this year, my name wasn't on my daughter's Christmas list. When the screen went dark, the past settled back into its proper place. I didn't sit and pick apart what had been said in the kitchen. I looked straight at the room in front of me. I knew who I would need to meet next, not to complain and not to retaliate, just to place what needed to be placed on the table, in the correct order, and that was when the present began. I picked up the phone and called Michael Grant, the man who had stood between me and houses for many years, long enough to know when a decision was no longer hypothetical. Michael answered after 2 rings, his familiar, steady voice of a seasoned broker, accustomed to decisions that didn't require long explanations. I stated my purpose directly. No detours, no family story, no emotions. Just one question. If a sale were needed, what had to be prepared to keep everything clean and orderly? Michael was silent for a few seconds, then asked exactly the right question. Do you want fast, or do you want clean? I want it done right, I said. Fast can come later. We met at his small office a few blocks from my place. The room wasn't large, the lighting just enough. A plain wooden desk, no unnecessary decor. Michael placed a thin file in front of me. He didn't open it right away, just laid out the steps clearly, like mapping a route. To sell properly, the title needed to be clean, insurance reviewed, escrow checked for any open items. Given the condition of the house, waiving contingencies was feasible, provided the paperwork was tightened from the start. Michael emphasized cash buyers to avoid timing issues tied to financing. I listened and nodded. Everything fit within the expectations of someone who had signed all kinds of documents for years. I didn't sign anything that day. I only asked Michael to prepare the file, update the documents, arrange the sequence. No listing sign, no public offering, no move that would draw attention. Michael understood, took notes, closed the file, set it aside. You haven't decided yet, he said. I've decided, I replied. I just haven't acted. On the way home, I stopped the car in front of the house. Midday was quiet. The front yard was neatly trimmed, windows clean, everything functioning as it should. I stood there for a moment without going inside, thinking about the parties held here, the compliments about the space, the light, the good taste, and also about the times I came by, chose my timing carefully, then left early. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and reviewed the stored documents. Nothing unexpected. Everything was in my name. All payments clear. I reorganized the folders, renamed a few files for easier tracking, not out of urgency, but readiness. That evening, I received a message from Lauren, a carefully worded invitation to Evan's company year-end party. Formal setting, partners present, friends included. She emphasized its importance and expressed hope I could attend, the tone polite enough that no one would mind if I declined. I read it and set the phone down, didn't reply immediately. I looked back at what I had prepared that day. One call, one meeting, a few papers placed where they belonged. No impulsive action, no hasty decision, just a path already drawn. I texted Lauren back briefly. I'll be there. Not for reconciliation, not to prove anything. I was going because everything was ready to be seen. When people choose to host a party, they've chosen the stage. The rest is timing. I closed the phone, stood up, turned off the light. On the table, the papers remained still, orderly. I wasn't selling yet. I was preparing. And in that preparation, I knew exactly what I was doing. Not breaking anything, just putting everything back in its proper place before stepping into the light. The party began just as the sky darkened. The lobby lighting was staged like a small theater, angled spotlights, thick carpet, background music low enough to make greetings sound more refined than usual. I arrived a few minutes earlier than the time printed on the invitation, paused at the edge of the entrance, straightened my cuffs, then stepped up onto the stone steps. The security desk sat right by the door. A printed name list, a marker, a badge scanner. The man in a black suit looked at me, his gaze lingering for half a beat. He asked my name, typed it in, then stopped. That pause carried the weight of an unopened door. He checked again, slower this time. I stood still, arms relaxed at my sides, feeling the lights fall across my shoulders. "Do you have an invitation?" he asked, keeping his distance just right. "I was invited," I said without elaboration. He tilted his head past the list to the person beside him. A quick glance, a thin slash of a mark. "Your name isn't on the guest list," the other said, polite enough to be faultless. Behind me, a few new arrivals paused, the sound of shoes on the floor forming a small, tight rhythm. I saw Lauren inside the lobby, laughing with a group of people. The lighting made her face look nothing like it did in the kitchen at home. I didn't explain. I lifted my chin slightly. "I'm the host's father." Security exchanged looks. No one said more. They held their line as if holding procedure. I stood there long enough to understand that this was a place where everything was sorted by lists. A check sounded from the stage. The sound technician tested the microphone. The speakers burst on for a moment, a voice echoing up to the high ceiling before dropping back into the lobby like a cold bead of water. "Testing." The sound brushed the walls, passed over the tables, went straight to the door. A few people turned their heads. Security hesitated for half a beat, then gestured for me to stand closer to the side. At that moment, Catherine Whitmore appeared, a board member of the kind of foundations the upper tier only dared to mention softly, a familiar presence at gatherings where looks determined position more than money. She arrived with two others, the practiced stride of someone who had crossed rooms like this many times before. She stopped when she saw me, her gaze landing briefly, assessing cleanly. Catherine smiled, the kind that didn't need warmth to be effective. "Richard," she said, calling my name like a well-known label. "I thought you weren't coming." "I am," I said, "just a bit early." She glanced at the security desk, then back at me. "Lists sometimes update slowly," she said, loud enough for the two beside her to hear, "especially when people are busy arranging the lights." The microphone sounded again, clearer this time. "1, 2, scattered laughter rippled through the lobby. Catherine leaned in and said quietly, "Everything here looks very orderly, but lighting always reveals the small details." I nodded. Nothing more was needed. Security received a signal over the radio. They opened the path. I stepped through, unhurried. The stone floor felt cool under my soles. Inside, tables were arranged in arcs, distances carefully measured. Eyes skimmed over me, quick, efficient, then moved on. A few lingered longer, as if posing silent questions. Lauren turned back, her smile slowed by a beat. I saw the calculation clearly. Step forward or hold position. She chose to stay where she was. I continued, stopping at the edge of the light, where the music was just loud enough to cover whispers. Catherine rested her hand on my arm for a brief moment, like stamping my presence. "It'll be a long evening," she said. "Stand here. Things will find their way to you." I looked around, lights, lists, microphones. Everything was in place. The party had chosen its stage. I only had to stand in the right spot. The sound in the reception hall echoed in the distinctive way of spaces designed to impress. High ceilings, spotlights cast down on clusters of people in conversation. The light, even clink of glassware touching, rhythmic and seemingly harmless. I stood slightly off-center, near the technical area people usually overlook because they assume nothing important happens there. The microphone was being tested, not for a formal speech, but for a brief introduction. A technician bent over the control table, saying something to a colleague, and no one noticed that the signal was already live. Lauren stood beside Evan, her smile held at the proper level, tilting her head as she listened to someone praising a new campaign, a vision, the self-made path she had taken. I watched the way she nodded, just humble enough, just confident enough. And in those stories I did not appear. Not because I was denied outright, but because I was unnecessary. I stepped forward a single pace, not to take the stage, but simply to be in the correct position when Catherine Whitmore approached. Unhurried, her step steady, her gaze practiced at assessing a room in seconds. "Are you well?" Catherine asked, her voice low and clear. "I'm fine," I replied, slower than before. She studied me more closely. "I heard you went through major surgery." I nodded. "A kidney donation." The words were not thrown, they were placed down, light but firm. I didn't raise my voice, didn't look for Lauren's eyes, spoke as if recalling a medical fact. Catherine tilted her head slightly. The moment was brief, but enough for those nearby to slow a beat. "You were the kidney donor?" she asked, not clearly to me or to the room. The microphone was still live. Perhaps they thought the outer channel had been cut, but the red indicator was still on. The question repeated through the sound system, wider and clearer, unintended yet irreversible, and a silence fell, not all at once, but spreading like oil. Lauren turned. She looked at me, then at Catherine, then around, her smile gone, replaced by its expression not yet chosen. I continued, not letting the gap stretch. "For Lauren," I said, "many years ago." No one asked more, but every gaze had shifted. "The house," Catherine went on, as if threading pieces now assembling themselves. "The house on Mesa Ridge? That's also in your name?" "Yes," I said. "I bought it. I kept the title." This time the silence was no longer neutral. It carried judgment, eyes flicking to Lauren, back to me, then away again, no one speaking. Yet everyone understanding the story had just been reordered. Lauren stepped forward, smiled, her mouth tight. "That isn't relevant tonight," she said, loud enough to be heard, light enough to pass as polite. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Catherine looked at Lauren directly. "You're right," she said, "but facts are still facts." Lauren swallowed, turned to me, her eyes no longer searching but defensive, and then, in a brief moment, when everything closed in too quickly, she blurted out a sentence, not to attack, but to escape. "I wish the kidney donor weren't my dad, so I wouldn't have to hear this ever again." The sentence wasn't shouted. It was spoken in clear, sharp English, reflexive, and the microphone, still live, did the rest. The sound carried without delay, hung in the hall long enough for everyone to understand exactly what they had heard. No more clinking glasses, no more whispers, only the lights and a sentence suspended in midair. Lauren stood frozen. Evan turned, too late. Catherine didn't react immediately. She simply looked at Lauren, not angry, not pitying, just measuring and concluding. I said nothing more. Everything had been repeated correctly, and when Catherine recalled it, it was no longer my story, no longer a narration. It became evidence. There are moments that don't need winning or losing. They only need to be heard in the right way, in the right place, and when that happens, no one can pretend they didn't hear. After that sentence, the room didn't explode. It deflated like a balloon slowly losing air, soundless but unmistakable in how its shape had changed. I remained still for a few seconds, not waiting for a reaction, but to be sure there was nothing left to say, because once the truth has been repeated loudly enough, explanation only dilutes it. I stepped out of the lighted area toward a side corridor, where it was quieter, and the party noise became a distant layer. I took out my phone, glanced at the screen for a beat, then dialed a familiar number. Michael Grant answered almost immediately. "Is it time?" he asked, without greeting. "Start," I said. "Follow the prepared sequence." No one stood close enough to hear, but I didn't lower my voice. I didn't need secrecy, only precision. Michael confirmed each step. "Open escrow tonight. Send confirmation email as soon as the system logged it. Push the clean title file to legal." I said okay at the right moments, paused at the right beats. The call ended cleanly. The phone vibrated almost simultaneously. An email arrived. the subject line short and neutral. Escrow initiated. I opened it, checked quickly. My name there, the address there, the start date and time clearly listed. No emotion in the document, only effect. When I returned to the hall, the atmosphere had shifted. No one spoke loudly. Groups that had clustered moments ago now broke into small gaps. A few handshakes happened quickly without accompanying conversation. Some glances slid toward me and then away, not avoidance, but recalibration. Catherine Whitmore stood near the reception table. She didn't approach, only gave a very slight nod as I passed, a gesture sufficient for others to understand that something had been acknowledged without need for annotation. Evan stood a few steps from Lauren. He looked at me, then at Lauren, then back at me. There was no argument, no difficult choice. Evan moved to my side, resting a hand on the back of a chair, as if choosing that position had always been obvious. Lauren saw it immediately. She opened her mouth, then closed it, and this time no sentence escaped. In another corner, two men in dark suits spoke very quietly. I recognized them from previous events, senior human resources at the agency where Lauren worked. One nodded, the other typed notes into his phone. No one looked toward Lauren, but the direction of the conversation was clear. Reputational review never begins with accusation, it begins with acknowledgement. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to witness every consequence to know how they would unfold. When I left, the music still played and the lights remained on, but the party had lost its most important element, the collective confidence that everything was fine. On the way home, Michael sent another line. Administrative leave is usually the first step. Investigation comes after. I read it and put the phone away. The timeline had been set, neither rushed nor delayed. I unlocked my apartment without turning on the lights, set my keys down, hung my coat, then went into the kitchen. Everything was quiet. I poured water and took a sip. There was no echo of the party in my head, only the clarity of things done. Some strikes don't require force. They only need to happen at the right moment, in front of the right people, without anyone stopping them. And tonight's call was exactly that. Not to punish, but to end a structure that had been mispositioned for far too long. The next morning, no alarm woke me. I opened my eyes to the familiar sensation of a day that had already been arranged in advance, like a construction project entering a phase where no more adjustments are possible. Everything was set, no shouting, no resistance, only the work of letting it proceed on schedule. Michael's email arrived at 7:12 a.m., with no greeting, no pleasantries, a subject line concise and coldly precise. Escrow confirmed. Cash buyer. Earnest money deposited into the trust account. A short contingency window remained. Then everything would continue forward. I read it through, closed the laptop, made coffee, stood by the window watching morning light slide across the tabletop. There was no sense of winning or losing, only the calm of someone who had signed long ago, not on paper, but in his mind. Near noon, the phone vibrated. Lauren's name appeared. Her voice wasn't like last night's. No sharp edge of someone standing in the middle of a party, no confident rhythm of someone used to speaking without waiting for a response. Only urgency, broken and uneven, like someone who had just realized she was slipping without a handrail. Dad, that house, are you really selling it? I didn't answer right away, not out of hesitation, but because some answers need to be heard in full. I'm not selling, I said slowly. I've already sold it. On the other end, there was a very long void. No crying, no rebuttal, just the silence of someone rechecking the ground beneath her feet and discovering it was never hers the way she thought. Dad, how am I supposed to manage on my own? Lauren whispered, and in that question was the full fear of someone realizing for the first time that no one was standing behind her keeping her balanced. You figure it out, I replied, for the first time. The call ended without a goodbye, without a promise to call back. Early afternoon, another call came in, an internal number, human resources. The woman's voice was even, trained to take no side, slow and clear, each word stamped in advance. We are initiating a reputational review process related to a public incident. During this time, Lauren will be placed on administrative leave. Not termination, no conclusion yet, but no chair left to sit in and wait for calm waters. I understand, I said, and I truly did. Around 4 p.m., Evan texted just one short line. Sir, is that house really in your name? Yes, I replied, from the beginning. 3 dots appeared for a long time. Then Evan sent another message. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Not knowing, I replied, isn't innocence. It just means no one had asked yet. That evening, Lauren came over, unannounced. No makeup, no expensive coat. Just a thin bag held with both hands, as if letting go would make her fall. She stood at the door of my apartment, the place that had never appeared in any success story of hers. The place with nothing to show off, only what was enough to live. She stepped inside, stopped, looked around, the pill organizer arranged by day on the shelf, the old shoes lined up against the wall, the low ceiling, warm yellow light, no paintings, no perfume. Lauren stood there for a long time, as if understanding for the first time that she was standing in real life, not a narrated version of it. I was put on leave, she said, her voice breaking, not strong enough to hold its shape. They called it temporary. Temporary is enough, I replied, enough to stop everything. Lauren sat down without adjusting her skirt, without keeping her back straight. For the first time, she was lower than me, not by position, but because there was nothing left to cling to. Catherine Whitmore was in the meeting, Lauren continued, tears falling without being wiped away. She didn't scold me, didn't accuse me. She just looked straight at me and asked, Is this how the company wants to be seen? I nodded. I had known that question would surface. They didn't need my answer, Lauren choked. Just that question was enough. A long silence followed. Evan took your side, Lauren said, her voice breaking completely. He said I went too far, that I could no longer tell the difference between ambition and ingratitude. Because you believed, I said slowly, that no one would ever pull their hand away from you. Lauren bowed her head, shoulders shaking. I thought you would never let me fall. I looked at her for a long time, not angry, not pitying, just looking at someone who had finally learned how hard the ground really is. I didn't push, I said. I just stopped holding. Lauren broke down, not the kind of crying meant to be comforted, but the sound tearing out of the chest of someone who had just realized that everything she had been standing on was borrowed, and the term had expired. Dad. Lauren lowered her head, her voice shattered. I don't know. If you don't hold me anymore, can I even stand? I didn't answer right away. Some questions can only be answered by the time and consequence. Lauren left when it was fully dark, without looking back, without asking to stay, only whispering softly at the door, I'm sorry for thinking you would always endure. The door closed. The room returned to silence. Escrow would close. The house would change hands. HR would continue their process. Other parties would still be held. Lights would still turn on. But there would be no more room for people who lived off the light and forgot the foundation. Some prices don't need a sentence. All it takes is stopping the support, and everything collapses on its own, according to its proper order. 6 to 9 months after that party, everything recalibrated in the quietest way possible. There was no declaration of victory, no belated explanations, and what had once been misplaced simply returned to where it belonged, like a house after a careful reset, more orderly, emptier, but easier to breathe in. I moved into a small condo near the ocean, not high-rise, not elaborate, with a narrow balcony just wide enough for 2 wooden chairs and a wind-hardy plant. In the mornings, I opened the door, let the salty air fill the room, made coffee, and sat watching the tide rise and fall in steady rhythm. My body was no longer as strong as before, but it was stable. I took short walks, rested at the right moments, took my medication on time, no longer trying to prove anything, just learning to listen to what my body said. Lauren entered a different rhythm as well. She left her old agency after an administrative leave that stretched longer than expected, and the new job was smaller, with less shine, fitting her ability and the moment she was in. There were no more packed parties, no more smoothly delivered self-made stories, and I heard that from others before I heard it from Lauren. I didn't ask and I didn't comment, because everyone needs time to stand still and see where they are. We met for a simple meal, not a fine restaurant, just a small place overlooking the marina with worn-edged wooden tables and a short menu. I arrived first. Lauren came later, neatly dressed, lightly made up, sat down, set her bag aside, looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You look better," she said. "Doing okay?" I replied. "I'm used to this pace now." We ordered grilled fish, salad, hot soup, just enough. No one brought up the party. No one dissected the sentence that once rang out over a microphone, and the silence between us was no longer tight. It was the pause needed for the story to continue without breaking. Lauren talked about the new job and relearning fundamentals. She didn't offer a long apology, just one sentence solid enough to stand on. I said things I shouldn't have said. I nodded. I heard them. She looked at me, waiting, and I didn't rush. "I don't carry the old story," I said, "but I'm not going back to the old place either." She understood. I could see it in the way she set her spoon down and slowed her breathing. We talked about practicalities, how often to meet, what to do and what not to do. Without offers of financial support and without requests for it, everything laid out clearly like lines on a blueprint, so each of us knew where we stood and didn't step into the other's space. The meal ended early. We stood. Lauren hesitated for a beat, then hugged me lightly. I didn't pull away and I didn't tighten. A hug enough to acknowledge presence, not enough to erase boundaries. That night, I stood on the balcony watching the sea darken as offshore lights blinked steadily, thinking about the years behind me, the choices I had set down, the price paid and what was received. There was no regret, no resentment, and no need to prove anything. I understood that forgiveness is not returning to what was before. Forgiveness is allowing yourself to move forward without the burden while keeping boundaries from being blurred again, because some boundaries, when drawn correctly, protect both sides. Love without boundaries is not love. It is indulgence. Some stories don't end with applause. They close with quiet, when everyone finally stands in the right place, no more and no less. I didn't win against anyone. I simply stopped losing myself. I learned that love is not giving until depletion, nor holding tight to prevent loss. Love is knowing when to step closer and when to step back exactly one pace, so both can remain standing. If you have ever had to set boundaries with someone you love, stayed silent not out of weakness, but because you understood your own worth. Leva, so I know you're there. And if you want to keep listening to stories where the truth doesn't need to shout, yet still stands upright, I would appreciate a follow.